It is customary to preface a work with an explanation of the author's aim, why he wrote the book, and the relationship in which he believes it to stand to other earlier or contemporary treatises on the same subject. In the case of a philosophical work, however, such an explanation seems not only superfluous, but in view of the nature of the subject matter, even inappropriate and misleading. For whatever might appropriately be said about philosophy in a preface, say a historical statement of the main drift and the point of view, the general content and results, a string of random assertions and assurances about truth, none of this can be accepted as the way in which to expound philosophical truth. Also, since philosophy moves essentially in the element of universality, which includes within itself the particular, it might seem that here more than in any other of the sciences, the subject matter itself, and even in its complete nature, were expressed in the aim and final results, the execution being by contrast really the unessential factor. On the other hand, in the ordinary view of anatomy, for instance, say the knowledge of the parts of the body regarded as inanimate, we are quite sure that we do not as yet possess the subject matter itself, the content of this science, but must in addition exert ourselves to know the particulars. Further, in the case of such an aggregate of information which has no right to bear the name of science, an opening talk about aim and other such generalities is usually conducted in the same historical and uncomprehending way in which the content itself, these nerves, muscles, etc., is spoken of. In the case of philosophy, on the other hand, this would give rise to the incongruity that along with the employment of such a method, its inability to grasp the truth would also be demonstrated. Furthermore, the very attempt to define how a philosophical work is supposed to be connected with other efforts to deal with the same subject matter drags in an extraneous concern, and what is really important for the cognition of the truth is obscured. The more conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth and falsity, the more it tends to expect a given philosophical system to be either accepted or contradicted, and hence it finds only acceptance or rejection. It does not comprehend the diversity of philosophical systems as the progressive unfolding of truth, but rather sees in it simple disagreements. The bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Similarly, when the fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in turn as the manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. These forms are not just distinguished from one another, they also supplant one another as mutually incompatible. Yet at the same time their fluid nature makes them moments of an organic unity in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each is as necessary as the other, and this mutual necessity alone constitutes the life of the whole. But he who rejects a philosophical system, that is, the new philosopher, does not usually comprehend what he is doing in this way, and he who grasps the contradiction between them, that is, the historian of philosophy, does not as a general rule know how to free it from its one-sidedness, or maintain it in its freedom by recognizing the reciprocally necessary moments that take shape as a conflict and seeming incompatibility. Demanding and supplying these superficial explanations passes readily enough as a concern with what is essential. Where could the inner meaning of a philosophical work find fuller expression than in its aims and results, and how could these be more exactly known than by distinguishing them from everything else the age brings forth in this sphere? Yet when this activity is taken for more than the mere beginnings of cognition, when it is allowed to pass for actual cognition, then it should be reckoned as no more than a device for evading the real issue, a way of creating an impression of hard work and serious commitment to the problem, while actually sparing oneself both. For the real issue is not exhausted by stating it as an aim, but by carrying out, nor is the result of actual whole, but rather the result together with the process through which it came about. The aim by itself is a lifeless universal, just as the guiding tendency is a mere drive that as yet lacks an actual existence. and the bare result is the corpse which has left the guiding tendency behind it. Similarly, the specific difference of a thing is rather its limit. It is where the thing stops, or it is what the thing is not. This concern with aim or results, with differentiating and passing judgment on various thinkers, is therefore an easier task than it might seem. For instead of getting involved in the real issue, this kind of activity is always a way beyond it. Instead of tiring with it and losing itself in it, this kind of knowing is forever grasping at something new. It remains essentially preoccupied with itself instead of being preoccupied with the real issue and surrendering to it. To judge a thing that has substance and solid worth is quite easy. To comprehend it is much harder, and to blend judgment and comprehension in a definitive description is the hardest thing of all. Culture, and its laborious emergence from the immediacy of substantial life, must always begin by getting acquainted with general principles and points of view, so as at first to work up to a general conception of the real issue, as well as learning to support and refute the general conception with reasons, then to apprehend the rich and concrete abundance of life by differential classification, and finally to give accurate instruction and pass serious judgment upon it. From its very beginning, culture must leave room for the earnestness of life in its concrete richness. This leads the way to an experience of the real issue, and even when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths by serious speculative effort, this kind of knowing and judging will still retain its appropriate place in ordinary conversation. The true shape in which truth exists can only be the scientific system of such truth. To help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title love of knowing and be actual knowing, that is what I have set myself to do. The inner necessity that knowing should be science lies in its nature, and only the systematic exposition of philosophy itself provides it. But the external necessity, so far as it is grasped in a general way, setting aside accidental matters of person and motivation, is the same as the inner, or in other words, it lies in the shape in which time sets forth the sequential existence of its moments. To show that now is the time for philosophy to be raised to the status of a science would therefore be the only true justification of any effort that has this aim. For to do so would demonstrate the necessity of the aim, would indeed at the same time be the accomplishment of it. To lay down that the true shape of truth is scientific, or what is the same thing, to maintain that truth has only the notion as the element of its existence, seems, I know, to contradict a view which is in our time as prevalent as it is pretentious, and to go against what that view implies. Some explanation, therefore, seems called for, even though it must for the present be no more than a bare assertion, like the view it contradicts. If, namely, the true exists only in what, or better as what, is sometimes called intuition, sometimes immediate knowledge of the absolute, religion, or being, not at the center of divine love, but the being of divine love itself, then what is required in the exposition of philosophy is seen from this viewpoint rather than the opposite of the form of the notion. For the absolute is not supposed to be comprehended, it is to be felt and intuited. Not the notion of the absolute, but the feeling and intuition of it must govern what is said, and must be expressed by it. If we apprehend a demand of this kind in its broader context, and view it as it appears at the stage which self-conscious spirit has presently reached, it is clear that spirit has now got beyond the substantial life it formerly led in the element of thought, that it is beyond the immediacy of faith, beyond the satisfaction and security of the certainty that consciousness then had of its reconciliation with the essential being, and of that being's universal presence both within and without. It has not only gone beyond all this into the other extreme of an insubstantial reflection of itself into itself, but beyond that too. Spirit has not only lost its essential life, it is also conscious of that loss, and of the finitude that is its own content. Turning away from the empty husks and confessing that it lies in wickedness, it reviles itself for so doing, and now demands from philosophy not so much knowledge of what it is, as the recovery through its agency of that lost sense of solid and substantial being. Philosophy is to meet this end not by opening up the fast-locked nature of substance and raising this to self-consciousness, not by bringing consciousness out of its chaos back to an order based on thought, not to the simplicity of the notion, but rather by running together what thought has put asunder, by suppressing the differentiations of the notion, and restoring the feeling of essential being. In short, by providing edification rather than insight. The beautiful, the holy, the eternal religion and love are the bait required to arouse the desire to bite, not the notion but the ecstasy, not the cold march of necessity in the thing itself, but the ferment of enthusiasm. These are supposed to be what sustains and continually extends the wealth of substance. In keeping with this demand is the strenuous, almost overzealous and frenzied effort to tear men away from their preoccupation with the sensuous, from the ordinary private affairs, and to direct their gaze to the stars, as if they had forgotten all about the divine and were ready like worms to content themselves with dirt and water. Formerly they had a heaven adorned with a vast wealth of thoughts and imagery. The meaning of all that is hung on the thread of light by which it was linked to that heaven. Instead of dwelling in this world's presence, men looked beyond it, following this thread to an otherworldly presence, so to speak. The eye of the spirit had to be forcefully turned and held fast to the things of this world, and it has taken a long time before the lucidity which only heavenly things used to have could penetrate the dullness and confusion in which the sense of worldly things was enveloped, and so make attention to the here and now as such, attention to what has been called experience, an interesting and valid enterprise. Now we seem to need just the opposite. Sense is so fast rooted in earthly things that it requires just as much force to raise it. The spirit shows itself so impoverished that, like a wanderer in the desert, craving for a mere mouthful of water, it seems to crave for its refreshment only by the bare feeling of the divine in general. By the little which now satisfies spirit, we can measure the extent of its loss. This modest complacency in receiving, or this sparingness in giving, does not, however, befit science. Whoever seeks mere edification, and whoever wants to shroud in a mist the manifold variety of his earthly existence and of thought, in order to pursue the indeterminate enjoyment of this indeterminate divinity, may look where he likes and find all this. He will find ample opportunity to dream up something for himself, but philosophy must beware of the wish to be edifying. Still less much this complacency which abjures science claim that such rapturous haziness is superior to science. This prophetic talk supposes that it is staying right in the centre and in the depths, looking disdainfully at determinateness, and deliberately holds aloof from notion and necessity as products of that reflection which is at home only in the finite. But just as there is an empty breath, so too there is an empty depth, and just as there is an extension of substance that pours forth as a finite multiplicity without the force to hold the multiplicity together, so there is an intensity without content, one that holds itself in a sheer force without spread, and this is in no way distinguishable from superficiality. The power of spirit is only as great as its expression, its depth only as deep as it dares to spread out and lose itself in its exposition. Moreover, when this non-conceptual, substantial knowledge professes to have sunk the idiosyncrasy of the self in essential being, and to philosophize in a true and holy manner, it hides the truth from itself by spurning measure and definition. Instead of being devoted to God, it merely gives free rein both to the contingency of the content within it and to its own caprice. Such minds, when they give themselves up to the uncontrolled ferment of the divine substance, imagine that by drawing a veil over the self-consciousness and surrendering understanding, they become the beloved of God, and whom he gives wisdom in sleep, and hence what they in fact receive and bring to birth in their sleep is nothing but dreams. Besides, it is not difficult to see that ours is a birth time and a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken with the world it has hitherto inhabited and imagined, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past, and in the labour of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward, but just as the first breath drawn by a child after his long quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of mere quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap, and the child is born. So likewise the spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structure of its previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted at by isolated symptoms. The frivolity and boredom which unsettle the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown, these are the heralds of approaching change. The gradual crumbling that left and altered the face of the whole is cut short by a sunburst which, in one flash, illuminates the features of this new world. But this new world is no more a complete actuality than is a newborn child. It is essential to bear this in mind. It comes on the scene for the first time in its immediacy or its notion, just as little as a building is finished when its foundation has been laid, so little is the achieved notion of the whole itself. When we wish to see an oak with its massive trunk and spreading branches and foliage, we are not content to be shown an acorn instead. So too science, the crown of a world of spirit, is not complete in its beginnings. The onset of the new spirit is the product of a widespread upheaval in various forms of culture, the prize at the end of a complicated, tortuous path, and of just as variegated and strenuous an effort. It is the whole which, having traversed its content in time and space, has returned into itself and is the resultant simple notion of the whole. But the actuality of this simple whole consists in those various shapes and forms which have become its moments and which will now develop and take shape afresh, this time in their new element, in their newly acquired meaning. While the initial appearance of the new worlds is to begin with only the whole veiled in its simplicity, or the general foundation of the whole, the wealth of previous existence is still present to consciousness in memory. Consciousness misses in the newly emerging shape its former range and specificity of content, and even more the articulation of form, whereby distinctions are securely defined and stand arrayed in their fixed relations. Without such articulation, science lacks universal intelligibility, and gives the appearance of being the esoteric possession of a few individuals, an esoteric possession, since it is as yet present only in its notion, or in its inwardness, of a few individuals, since its undiffused manifestation makes its existence something singular. Only what is completely determined is at once exoteric, comprehensible, and capable of being learned and appropriated by all. The intelligible form of science is the way open and equally accessible to everyone, and consciousness, as it approaches science, justly demands that it be able to attain to rational knowledge, by way of the ordinary understanding. For the understanding is thought, the pure I as such, and what is intelligible is what is already familiar and common to science and the unscientific consciousness alike, the latter through its having afforded direct access to the former. Science in its early stages, when it has attained neither to completeness of detail nor perfection of form, is vulnerable to criticism. But it would be as unjust for such criticism to strike at the very heart of science, as it is untenable to refuse to honour the demand for its further development. This polarization seems to be the Gordian knot with which scientific culture is at present struggling, and which it still does not properly understand. One side boasts of its wealth of material and intelligibility, the other side at least scorns its intelligibility and flaunts its immediate rationality and divinity. Even if the former side is reduced to silence, whether by the force of truth alone or by the blustering of the other, and even if, in respect to fundamentals, it feels itself outmatched, it is by no means satisfied regarding the said demands, for they are justified but not fulfilled. Its silence stems only half from the triumph of its opponent, and half from the boredom and indifference which tend to result from the continual awakening of expectations through unfulfilled promises. As for content, the other side makes it easy enough for themselves at times to display a great expanse of it. They appropriate a lot of already familiar and well-oiled material. By focusing on rare and exotic instances, they give the impression that they have hold of everything else which scientific knowledge had already embraced in its scope, and that they are also in command of such material as is yet unordered. It thus appears that everything has been subjected to the absolute idea, which therefore seems to be cognized in everything and to have matured into an expanded science. But a closer inspection shows that this expansion has not come about through one and the same principle, having spontaneously assumed different shapes, but rather through the shapeless repetition of one and the same formula, only externally applied to diverse materials, thereby obtaining merely a boring show of diversity. The idea, which of course is true enough on its own account, remains in effect always in its primitive condition, if its development involves nothing more than this sort of repetition of the same formula. When the knowing subject goes around applying this single inert form to whatever it encounters, and dipping the material into this placid element from outside, this is no more the fulfillment of what is needed, that is, a self-originating, self-differentiating wealth of shapes, than any arbitrary insights into the content. Rather, it is a monochromatic formalism which only arrives at the differentiation of its material, since this has already been provided and is by now familiar. Yet this formalism maintains that such monotony and abstract universality are the absolute, and we are assured that dissatisfaction with it indicates the inability to master the absolute standpoint and to keep hold of it. Time was when the bare possibility of imagining something differently was sufficient to refute an idea, and this bare possibility, this general thought, also had the entire positive value of an actual cognition. Nowadays we see all value ascribed to the universal idea in this non-actual form, in the undoing of all distinct determinate entities, or rather the hurling of them into the abyss of vacuity, without further development or any justification, is allowed to pass muster as a speculative mode of treatment. Dealing with something from the perspective of the absolute consists merely in declaring that, although one has been speaking of it just now as something definite, yet in the absolute, the A equals A, there is nothing of the kind, for there all is one. To pit this single insight, that in the absolute everything is the same, again the full body of articulated cognition, which at least seeks and demands such fulfillment, to palm off its absolute as the night in which, as the saying goes, all cows are black. This is cognition naively reduced to vacuity. The formalism which recent philosophy denounces and despises, only to see it reappear in its midst, will not vanish from science, however much its inadequacy may be recognized and felt, till the cognizing of absolute actuality has become entirely clear as to its own nature. Since the presentation of a general idea in outline, before any attempt to follow it out in detail, makes the latter attempt easier to grasp, it may be useful at this point to give a rough idea of it, at the same time taking the opportunity to get rid of certain habits of thought which impede philosophical cognition. In my view, which can only be justified by the exposition of the system itself, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true not only as substance but equally as subject. At the same time, it is to be observed that substantiality embraces the universal or the immediacy of knowledge itself, as well as that which is being of immediacy of knowledge, foreknowledge. If the conception of God as the one substance shocked the age in which it was proclaimed, the reason for this was, on the one hand, an instinctive awareness that in this definition, self-consciousness has only submerged and not preserved. On the other hand, the opposite view, which clings to thought as thought, to universality as such, is the very same simplicity, is undifferentiated, unmoved substantiality. And if thirdly, thought does unite itself with the being of substance, and apprehends immediacy or intuition as thinking, the question is still whether this intellectual intuition does not again fall back into inert simplicity, and does not depict actuality itself in a non-actual manner. Further, the living substance is being which is in truth subject, or what is the same, is in truth actual only insofar as it is movement of positing itself, or is the mediation of itself othering with itself. This substance is as subject pure simple negativity, and is for this very reason the bifurcation of the simple. It is the doubling which sets up opposition, and then again the negation of this indifferent diversity and of its antithesis, the immediate simplicity. Only this self-restoring sameness, or this reflection in otherness within itself, not an original or immediate unity as such, is the true. It is the process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal, having its end also as its beginning, and only by being worked out to its end is it actual. Thus the life of God and divine cognition may well be spoken of as a disporting of love with itself, but this idea sinks into mere edification and even insipidity if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labour of the negative. In itself that life is indeed one of the untroubled equality and unity with itself, for which otherness and alienation and the overcoming of alienation are not serious matters, but this in itself is abstract universality, in which the nature of the divine life to be for itself, and so too the self-movement of the form, are altogether left out of account. If the form is declared to be the same as the essence, then it is ipso facto a mistake to suppose that cognition can be satisfied with the in itself or the essence, but can get along without the form. That the absolute principle or absolute intuition makes the working out of the former or the development of the latter superfluous, Just because the form is essential to the essence as the essence is to itself, the divine essence is not to be conceived and expressed merely as essence, that is, as immediate substance or pure self-contemplation of the divine, but likewise as form, and in the whole wealth of the developed form. Only then it is conceived and expressed as an actuality. The true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence, consummating itself through its development. Of the absolute it must be said that it is essentially a result, that only in the end is it what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, viz. To be actual, subject to spontaneous becoming of itself. Though it may seem contradictory that the absolute should be conceived essentially as a result, it needs little pondering to set this show of contradiction in its true light. The beginning, the principle, or the absolute, as at first immediately enunciated, is only the universal. Just as when I say all animals, this expression cannot pass for zoology, so it is equally plain that the words the divine, the absolute, the eternal, etc., do not express what is contained in them, and only such words in fact do express the intuition as something immediate. Whatever is more than such a word, even the transition to a mere proposition, contains a becoming other that has to be taken back, or is the mediation. But it is just this that is rejected with horror, as if the absolute cognition were being surrendered when more is made of mediation than is simply saying that it is nothing absolute, and is completely absent in the absolute.